Hi, 72 Daystar, out in the walking vlog. This unusually mild January evening. I was doing my usual thing, talking to believers on the internet. I kind of realized that I'd done this an average of once a week for most of the last 6 years, and so that totals to about 300 of these dialogues or debates that I've had, which is, I don't know, I'd never imagined I would do such a thing, but here it is. So this guy, I was putting it to him with one of my favorite pictures. You might have seen it yourself. It's a series of skulls, of hominid skulls. Actually, one of them is a chimpanzee skull, starting, then it goes to Australopithecine, and right up to Homo sapien at the end. And you can see, if you look carefully, it's very gradual. The shape of the skull changes quite gradually. It's really impressive, I thought, but he avoided it a couple of times, and I really put it to him, kind of cornered him on it, and said, so I'm asking him, so where do the apes stop, and where do the humans begin? And his response was to say, well, who's to say that these weren't just, a half dozen or a dozen, I forget how many skulls were in the series, of unrelated, just coincidentally are shaped the same. And why couldn't that be true? Well, see, the problem is, it's not just humans. The problem with that position would be the tree of life. Now, this is Linnaeus of taxonomies begins this, but it has been fleshed out quite substantially since then. And all of the fleshing out has turned out to be entirely consistent with the theory of evolution. So not only do you have, Linnaeus started by looking at the shapes of things, how things reproduced, and classified them that way, very systematically. But it goes beyond that. So we could take these bones, as we could the skulls, and look very carefully at their similarities, and we would come up with this tree of life. We could do the same thing if we happen to have their DNA, and we'd come up with a very similar tree of life. And it goes on. We could use the endogenous retroviruses in their DNA to make a similar structure and look at the biochemistry of each of these animals and come up with a similar structure. Now, what would explain that? Well, what very neatly explains that is a common origin of all of those animals and plants. That very neatly accounts for them. What else would account for this? Well, do I know? But I think it was Aaron Ra who suggested the only other thing that would explain such an event would be a devious god, a god that wanted it to appear that we had resulted from common ancestry, but in fact we're created magically by him. So my question for atheists: how do you get? What techniques would you use to try to get them to bridge the gap between? We'll look at all of these huge coincidences that seem to suggest common ancestry. All of this overlapping nested hierarchy, and yet in those 300 dialogues, well, not all of them, the ones that we did talk about evolution, I very often brought up the tree of life as an evidence for evolution. I think it's a very powerful piece of evidence for evolution, but as yet I haven't met a believer, a creationist that is, because there are plenty of believers who do accept evolution, but I haven't encountered a creationist who seems to even understand what a nested hierarchy is. So for atheists, how do you get them to bridge that gap to go from, okay, well, all of these family trees coincide. You know what would explain that? Common ancestry would explain that very neatly. How do you get them to bridge that gap? And if you happen to be a creationist, don't you at least think that these nested hierarchies, that the genetics match up with the morphology, and those match up with the biochemistry, and those match up with the endogenous retrovirus in our DNA, the scars from viral infections? And doesn't that at least suggest common ancestry to you? If not, why not? Thoughts for the evening? 72 Daystar, out.